The wind slammed into Eli with a force that felt almost personal, like it was trying to throw him off the mountain. Snow whipped across his face in stinging waves, seeping into his jacket collar and blinding him as he leaned into the slope. One misstep meant 100-foot fall into jagged rocks below, but Eli didn't care. Not really. His boots crunched through the thin crust of ice along the trail's edge, each step heavier than the last. The trail, once familiar, had turned on him, but that was fitting. Everything had turned on him lately: work, friends, family, life, and now the mountain, too. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward. The only sound, besides the wind howling through the canyon, was the thump of his heart. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for out here in the snow and silence. Maybe he wasn't looking at all. Maybe he was hiding. His foot slipped out. A chunk of ice broke free beneath his boot, clattering down the cliffside and disappearing into the white void below. Eli froze, breath caught in his throat, arms out, knees bent, muscles locked in terror. The drop was instant. No trees, no slope, just air. His pulse thundered as he took 2 careful steps back to safer ground. The storm, unbothered by his near death, continued shrieking around him. He exhaled shakily, jaw clenched. For a second, just a second, he'd felt a strange relief. If he'd fallen, it would have been over. Simple, quick. No more ache in his chest, no more waking up to that crushing silence. But he hadn't fallen, and something inside him, quiet but stubborn, still cared. The cold had long since soaked into his bones, but it didn't hurt. Not the way grief did. He remembered the voicemail, his sister's voice, tight and broken. "He's gone, Eli. He didn't make it." Eli had played it once. That was enough. He'd packed a bag and vanished into the mountains the next day. The trail was a distraction, a way to stay busy, to feel pain that made sense. Frozen fingers, blistered heels, windburn. These were things he could control. But the grief, the hollowness that pressed on his ribs with every breath, that was a storm he couldn't outwalk. The blizzard around him blurred the trail and his thoughts. He missed things he hadn't noticed were gone. His laughter, his voice, his sense of direction, not just on the trail, but in life. He kept walking, because turning back felt worse at first. He thought it was a trick of the wind, but then he heard it again, a sharp, clipped bark, carried through the storm, desperate, isolated, alive. Eli stopped dead. The wind fought to drown it out, but the sound returned, a bark that didn't belong in the mountains, not in this weather, not out here. He turned slowly, scanning the cliffside and valley below, snow clouding his vision. The barking came again, weaker this time, a strangled cry that cut through the wind and sliced straight into his chest. Someone or something was out there, and it was in trouble. He stood there, torn between instinct and empathy. He should keep going. It was dangerous enough already. He wasn't trained for rescues. He was barely holding himself together. But something about that bark, it wasn't just panic. It was hope, raw and pleading. Not a wild animal's cry, but a call for help. Soul hanging on. He clenched his fists, jaw tight, breath clouding in the air. He didn't know what he was walking into. But for the first time in weeks, he felt pulled toward something instead of away from everything, and so, with frozen limbs and a heart that had nearly stopped caring, Eli turned toward the sound. Eli pushed forward, boots crunching against snow-packed earth, the cold slicing through his jacket like razors. He moved toward the sound, heart thudding, unsure if what he heard had been real or imagined. But then it came again, a bark, short and strained, nearly swallowed by the storm. It was too deliberate, too pleading, to be just wind. His breath caught in his throat. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the white chaos, something was fighting to be heard, to be found. His hands trembled, not just from cold, but from the shift inside him. The numbness that had dulled everything since his brother died began to crack. He adjusted his pack and veered off trail, his pulse rising with each step. This wasn't part of the plan, but something inside him, something buried, whispered, "Don't turn away." The slope steepened suddenly, and through a curtain of swirling snow, Eli spotted a jagged outcrop jutting over the valley. Just below, on a narrow ledge no wider than a kitchen shelf, a dog clung to life. A German shepherd. Her paws slipped against loose gravel, claws scrabbling for grip. Her chest heaved, and she whimpered softly, barely audible over the wind. Mud matted her fur, one ear torn, ribs clearly visible. She looked up, their eyes locked, not wild, not feral, not lost, terrified. The sheer wrongness of her being there hit Eli like a punch. That ledge was death, an inch of misstep from eternity. Yet there she stood, watching him, not barking now, not panicking, just waiting, his legs locked in place. The danger was obvious. He wasn't trained for rescues. He didn't even know if she'd let him near. But the way she looked at him, like he was the only hope left, cut deeper than the cold ever could. Eli's breath fogged in front of him, but his mind was somewhere else, years back, on a dirt trail behind his childhood home, Bailey, a mutt with floppy ears and an endless supply of patience. He remembered her final days, how cancer had taken her too fast, the helplessness, the silence after. He hadn't thought of her in years, but now, staring down at this shepherd, desperate, trembling, not barking but asking it, all came rushing back. The world narrowed to that one fragile soul, and Eli realized he wasn't just looking at a dog on a ledge, he was looking for a reason. He stepped back. The wind roared louder, as if agreeing with the voice inside him. Leave it, you'll fall. You can't save her. Logic laid out its cold facts. The storm was worsening. The ledge was unstable. He had no gear for an animal rescue. No guarantee the dog wouldn't lash out. He'd barely held himself together since his brother died. He couldn't afford another loss. But she didn't look away. She stood still, watching, as if daring him not to leave. Eli's boots didn't move. Neither did the ache in his chest. There was a time he would have kept walking. Today wasn't that day. Eli knelt, pulling a coil of rope from his pack. His fingers fumbled at the knots, numb with cold and nerves. The ground here was firmer, but the slope below curved sharply into emptiness. One wrong move, and they'd both be gone. He tested the anchor twice. Then again, the wind howled against his ears, and he sucked in a breath. "This is stupid," he muttered, then tied the harness around his waist anyway. Every inch down felt like a mile. Snow clung to his lashes. The rope creaked with his weight. His boots slid more than they stepped. He didn't look at the drop. He looked at her. She hadn't moved, just trembled, eyes never leaving him. The ledge was smaller, up close. Eli crouched, body stiff with adrenaline. She flinched as he reached out, but didn't growl, didn't bite, only breathed. Slowly, gently, he looped the rope around her chest. She tensed, then sagged against him, legs shaking. Her weight pressed into his arms, solid and real. The rocks beneath his boots shifted, pebbles tumbling into the abyss. He gritted his teeth and whispered, "Hang on." Then they moved, upward, together. When they reached the top, Eli collapsed. First, she followed, her body crumpling beside him like a breath finally exhaled. She didn't run, she didn't bark, she just rested her head on his thigh. Eyes closing as if to say, finally. Eli sat still, barely breathing. He stared at the rise and fall of her chest, the crusted blood on her ear, the bruises that looked too familiar, scars that weren't from rocks. He reached a hand to her. She didn't flinch. He didn't pull away, for the first time in weeks. Something inside Eli softened, a warmth that had nothing to do with fire, nothing to do with running. They didn't speak the same language, but in that moment, neither of them felt alone. Eli sat across from the dog, watching him from behind a small campfire that hissed in protest against the snow. The shepherd lay curled in a tight circle, head resting on his paws, eyes flickering open at every sound. Silent, guarded, still not sure if he was truly safe. "You look like you were made of smoke," Eli muttered softly, hiding in silence. "Almost disappeared on me." The dog didn't move, but his ears twitched. Eli nodded to himself. Shadow, that fits. The name hung in the cold air between them. No tail wag, no acknowledgement, but Eli didn't need one. Giving the dog a name felt like anchoring something, like both of them needed a tether. In the days that followed, Shadow's presence remained more echo than substance. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just hovered at the edge of Eli's space, always alert, always tense. The loud crack of a branch or the crunch of heavy boots made him cower. Even Eli's slow approach was enough to send him backing away, ribs shivering under his thin coat. Eli tried not to take it personally. Still, it stung. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said once, holding out a strip of dried jerky. Shadow wouldn't take it from his hand. Only when Eli turned away and left it on the snow did the dog sneak forward and eat. Eli had seen broken before in people, in himself. But on this dog, it was written in every twitch and tremble. Shadow wasn't just skittish, he was haunted. Eli had planned to descend the mountain that morning. Instead, he gathered more wood. The storm had eased, but Shadow still refused to come close, barely sleeping, barely eating. Eli couldn't bring himself to walk away. Not yet, so he stayed. He made camp with more care shaped a windbreak cleared. Snow from the shelter floor, folded a second blanket near the fire. Shadow didn't use it the first night, but Eli didn't pack it up. He spoke sometimes, just to break the silence, told stories, pointless ones, memories of hiking with his brother, of Bailey, his childhood dog who used to sleep at the foot of his bed. Shadow didn't respond, but he didn't leave either, and sometimes silence was the loudest form of listening. That night the forest came alive in whispers, branches creaked, leaves rustled, and something distant howled into the dark. Shadow bolted upright, ears flat, tail tucked. He paced near the fire but didn't settle, always turning to the trees as if expecting the past to claw its way out of the dark. Eli didn't sleep much either. Every time the fire cracked, Shadow jumped. At one point, a snapping branch sent him running behind a fallen log. Eli got up slowly, sat near him, kept his voice low and steady. "It's just the woods, bud. Just noise." Shadow didn't move. His eyes, wide and white, stayed locked on the dark. Eli sat beside him anyway. Even after his fingers went numb, the fear was real. For both of them, Eli had come to the mountain to lose himself. Now, he found himself afraid of what might happen. If he did, in the morning, Shadow didn't vanish into the woods. He hovered a little closer to camp. He still didn't accept food from Eli's hand, but he stopped flinching when their eyes met. That afternoon, while Eli chopped wood, he noticed Shadow lying nearby, curled and guarded, but stretched out. Head resting on crossed paws, relaxed, a shift, small but unmistakable. Eli didn't mention it, didn't try to push, just acknowledged the moment with a glance and a nod. "You're getting brave," he whispered. Shadow lifted his head but didn't run. That was enough, in a world full of sudden loss and fragile second chances. Enough mattered. More than ever, thunder cracked like splitting stone. The storm came out of nowhere, rolling over the ridge with rain and cold wind that lashed the camp. Eli scrambled to secure the tarp and cover their gear. Rain soaked his shoulders, chilled his spine. He glanced around in a panic. Shadow had vanished. His chest tightened. Had it been too much? He ducked under the tarp, dripping, breathing hard. Then, in the corner of his eye, movement. Shadow stood at the edge of the camp, soaked, shivering, but not running, not hiding. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward. Then he curled beside Eli. Not touching, but close, close enough to share heat, close enough to say without words, "I'm here. I choose to be here." Eli didn't speak. He just draped the extra blanket over them both and let the silence settle in. This time it felt warm. The fog settled in thick the next morning, blanketing the trees in silence. Eli was boiling water when the snarl came, low, guttural and wrong. A flash of movement. A wild animal, fur bristling and teeth bared, charged through the mist. A stray wolf, a starving coyote. Eli didn't know. He only had seconds to react. He grabbed a burning stick from the fire and swung wildly, shouting, trying to look bigger. Then he felt. The creature lunged, then a blur, Shadow. The dog slammed into the attacker. With a snarl Eli had never heard before. He fought like a creature reborn, no longer cowering, but protecting. Together, they drove it off. When the animal finally fled into the fog, Shadow limped back toward Eli, blood at his side. He didn't collapse. He didn't retreat. He stood over Eli like a soldier guarding something sacred. Eli knelt beside Shadow, heart pounding. "Let me see," he murmured, running his hands gently over the wound. Just a gash, deep but not fatal. He cleaned it carefully, whispering soft nonsense as he worked. Shadow didn't growl, didn't move, just watched him with calm, steady eyes. It hit Eli then, not just what Shadow had done, but what it meant. This wasn't a stray anymore. This was a companion, a protector, a choice. When the fire burned down that night, Shadow didn't lie at a distance. He rested his head on Eli's boot. Eli sat back, tired beyond the physical, and let the emotion settle in. Not the sharp grief that had followed him up the mountain, but something slower, deeper. Connection. They were no longer two strangers. Bound by fear, they were survivors, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. The paper was yellowed, edges curled by time and weather, but the image was clear. A German shepherd, ears alert, eyes sharp, coat darker, then cleaner. The headline screamed across the top in bold. "Missing, Max. Reward if found. Contact Don." Kinney. Eli stared at it, the wind pressing against his jacket as if urging him to move on, but he couldn't. Shadow Max wasn't a ghost anymore. He had a name, a past, and someone claiming to want him back. His fingers clenched the strap of his pack. 1,000 thoughts collided in his chest. Confusion, betrayal, fear. He'd saved this dog. They'd fought to survive together. But now the world wanted to pull them apart like none of that mattered. He read the contact number 3 times, but couldn't dial Dot because in his gut something didn't sit right. The name echoed in Eli's mind like an unwanted echo. Max. It felt wrong in his mouth, too sharp, too impersonal. A name assigned, not earned. He thought of Shadow curled at his feet by the fire, how he'd defended Eli from a wild animal, how, for the first time in months, Eli had really laughed because of him. He wasn't afraid of the name. He was afraid of what it meant. Because names come with ownership, with rights, with endings. Shadow wasn't just some dog he'd stumbled on. He was part of Eli's healing. A companion born not of ownership, but of choice. The thought of losing him was like watching that ledge crumble all over again. Only this time, he might not be fast enough to save him. Back at the cabin, Shadow sensed it instantly. He didn't rush to Eli when he came through the door, didn't curl at his feet, didn't even make a sound, just watched. Quiet, waiting. Eli unpacked. Slowly, the poster folded deep in his coat. He didn't know what to say, how to hide the crack that had formed between them. But Shadow felt it anyway. That night, he didn't eat much. He didn't rest beside Eli's cot. He curled near the door. Eli lay awake in the dim glow of the lantern, guilt pressing into his chest like a second heartbeat. Shadow had let him in, had fought for him, and now, even without words, he could feel himself being pushed away, not by Eli's actions, but by his hesitation. And in Shadow's world, hesitation had always meant hurt was coming. The address on the flyer led Eli to a run-down outpost to town south. He knocked once. A man answered, thick arms, beer on his breath, impatience in his eyes. "You got my dog?" Eli studied his face. Something about the man twisted his stomach. "I think so," Eli replied carefully, "but I need to ask a few questions." The man sneered. "It's a dog, not a child. You find him or not." Eli didn't flinch. "Tell me how he got lost." The man rolled his eyes. "Ran off, spooked by thunder. Damned mutt's always been skittish." Eli's hands curled into fists. "That skittish dog has a torn ear, a healing rib, and flinches every time someone raises a voice." The man's mask slipped just for a second. "Dogs get hurt. Not my fault if he's soft." Eli stepped back, chest tight with fury. He didn't need proof. He'd already seen it in Shadow's scars, his silence, and the way he had to unlearn fear. He turned to leave. The man grabbed his arm. Shadow had waited in the truck, window cracked. But the moment Eli opened the door and the man's voice rang out behind him, something in the dog shifted. Shadow leaped from the seat. The second the man stepped into the clearing, Shadow froze, body stiff as stone. The air changed. Hackles raised, tail low. His entire frame trembled not with cold, but with memory. The man took a step closer, smug. "Max, there you are, good boy." But Shadow didn't move, didn't whine, didn't run. He lowered his head and backed away slowly, a low growl rising in his throat like something buried too long finally breaking the surface. And in that sound, Eli heard everything. It was true. It was painful, and it was all the evidence he needed. "Let him go," Eli said, stepping between them. But the man lunged, fists swinging. They hit the ground hard, elbows scraping rock, fists connecting with ribs. Eli gasped as pain exploded through his side. He tried to push the man off, but the rage was wild, unrelenting. Then a blur of fur and teeth. Shadow, the dog, launched himself at the man's arm, clamping down with a snarl that came from someplace primal. The man shouted, trying to shake him off, but Shadow held firm Nut, attacking wildly. But guarding Dot, defending Dot, Eli managed to crawl back, breath ragged. Shadow enough. He gasped. The dog let go, but didn't back away. He stood over Eli's body, snarling, every inch of him daring the man to try again. And in that moment, Eli knew Shadow wasn't afraid anymore. He had chosen his place, and it was here by the time the Rangers arrived. The man was bleeding, humiliated, and furious, but no longer a threat. Eli's statement was clear, calm, detailed, and supported by Shadow's reaction and the scars that matched the story. He was abused. Eli said simply, and he's not going back. The officers nodded, piecing it together. The man was cuffed without argument. For once, Eli felt something settle inside him. Not victory, but justice. Shadow sat beside him, pressed against his leg knot, shaking, not watching the door for escape. Just there, as the Rangers loaded the man into the truck, one turned to Eli. "You got papers on him?" Eli shook his head. The Ranger smiled. "Then you'll need to file for ownership, but I don't think there'll be a problem." Eli looked down at Shadow, who looked up at him like he'd always belonged there. "Come on, boy," he whispered. Shadow followed without hesitation, not because he was owned, but because he was home. The town hadn't changed much, but Eli had. The streets were the same. The coffee shop still played bad 80s music, and the bookstore still had the crooked sign. But now, when Eli walked those streets, Shadow walked beside him. There was a rhythm to it, not perfect, not predictable, but real. They moved through routines like old friends relearning a language. Morning walks, breakfast on the porch. Eli read while Shadow lay with his head across Eli's boots. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. Neighbors asked questions, of course, about the dog, where he came from, who he belonged to. Eli would smile and say simply, "He found me when I needed him," and no one asked twice, because the truth showed in the way Shadow watched Eli's every move, in the way they existed, not as man and pet, but as survivors, turned companions. Eli returned to work slowly, easing back into the rhythm of it. But it felt different now, not like an escape, like a choice. He still hiked most mornings before sunrise. The leash was loose in his hand, Shadow trotting calmly beside him. They didn't rush. There was no need. With every step, Eli felt the weight he'd carried for so long begin to lift, not vanish, but settle. Colleagues noticed the change. He smiled more, laughed even, and when someone asked what had happened out there, he gave them the same answer he gave himself. "I found something worth staying for." It started one evening on the porch. A car backfired in the distance. Eli braced out of habit, but Shadow didn't flinch. He barked, just once. A sharp, confident sound that rang into the night like a declaration, not of fear, but of presence. Eli looked at him, surprised. "That's yours?" he asked with a grin. Shadow gave a small huff and laid back down, tail thumping twice. After that, things started to shift in quiet ways. Shadow played, again chasing thrown sticks, wrestling with the neighbor's golden retriever. He even let a stranger scratch behind his ears, and Eli, he wrote again. The words didn't come easy at first, but they came. Pages filled with stories, reflections, pieces of the mountain that refused to be forgotten. He emailed his sister, called her, too. And when she cried, hearing his voice, Eli didn't hang up like he once would have. He stayed, because the healing wasn't loud. It just needed space to speak. Their hikes weren't about getting lost anymore. They were about moving forward. The trails they once used to escape now held a different kind of power reconnection. Freedom, purpose. Where once Eli walked alone, untethered and broken, he now moved beside Shadow, stride for stride. There were no cliffs to fear now, no edges begging to be leaned over, only dirt underfoot, wind in the trees, the crunch of leaves, and the soft breath of a dog who'd once known nothing but fear, now walking in joy. Some days they went far, other days not at all, but every day. They walked together, and that was enough. Eli had avoided the cliff trail for months, but one crisp morning he stood at its entrance again, leash in hand, heart steady. Shadow looked up at him, as if asking, "Are you sure?" Eli nodded, his voice soft. "Let's go." They moved slowly at first. The old fear tugged at the edges, but it didn't own him anymore. The trail twisted just as sharply as before, the drop just as steep, but this time Eli wasn't searching for pain, and he wasn't alone. Halfway through the hike, they paused at the ledge, the one where Shadow had clung to life, where Eli had made a choice to climb, to risk, to try. Now the ledge sat quiet under golden light. No fear, no storm, only peace. Shadow sat at Eli's side. Breathing calmly, Eli reached down, resting a hand on the back of his neck. "We made it," he whispered. They reached the ridge as the sun broke over the treetops, bathing everything in gold. Shadow's coat shimmered. Eli's face softened. The wind carried no chill this time, just promise. They stood for a long while, watching the light stretch across the land. Shadow pressed closer, and Eli laid a hand over his heart, feeling the quiet rhythm of something whole again. The pain hadn't vanished. His brother was still gone. The grief still lived inside him, but it no longer swallowed everything he had. Found a way forward, not by forgetting, but by holding on to what still mattered, to what had survived. And in that moment, with Shadow at his side and the world laid out before them, Eli finally understood. Healing isn't about going back. It's about walking on with what you've loved beside you. Eli once believed that falling meant failure, that slipping from the world emotionally, mentally, was the same as disappearing. But standing beside Shadow, watching the horizon stretch wide and golden, he knew better now. Shadow hadn't been lost, just waiting for someone to listen, to stop, to see him. And Eli, he had been doing the same, running not from the world, but from a version of himself he no longer knew how to live with. They hadn't rescued each other in some grand, noble way. It wasn't neat or poetic. It was desperate, messy, real. But somehow, through snow and scars, they'd found each other. And maybe that was the point. Some souls don't fall to be broken. They fall so someone will catch them. Eli thought love came like thunder, loud, obvious. But when he looked back now, he realized it had come quietly, in the shiver of a frightened dog pressed against stone, in the decision to anchor a rope instead of walking away, in the soft curl of a tail against his leg during a storm. It wasn't certain at first. Love rarely is. It came in fragments, small choices, that together built something whole. And for both of them, It hadn't felt safe. Not right away, because real love doesn't always announce itself with warmth. Sometimes it shows up in the middle of the coldest night, barely clinging on, waiting for someone to say, "I'm not leaving." There had been no miracle moment, no dramatic sunrise where everything suddenly felt okay. Healing came slowly in firelight, flickering against a cave wall, in the steady rhythm of footsteps along a worn trail, in the quiet companionship of a dog who didn't speak, but always understood. Shadow had stopped flinching. Eli had started laughing again. There were still bad days, still echoes of pain that rose without warning, but they faced them differently now. Not alone, because healing doesn't need to be loud. It just needs space, and someone who stays. Eli sometimes looked at Shadow and wondered what would have happened if he hadn't followed the bark, if he hadn't turned toward the ledge, if he'd chosen safety over instinct. But he didn't dwell there long, because what mattered wasn't the what dash. If it was the what now, Shadow wasn't lost anymore, and neither was he. They had found each other at their lowest, not by design, not by destiny, but by the simple, stubborn act of not turning away. Some connections aren't built, they're uncovered, patiently waiting beneath the weight of everything we thought we couldn't carry. And when we finally reach them, we remember who we are, and we remember we were never alone.